Hello everyone, Waddling Duck here to describe how Diablo 4 combines different damage stats, allowing you to turn an ability dealing thousands of damage into an ability dealing millions of damage. There are a lot of guides out there describing damage buckets, and while secondary stat interactions are well described, every guide that I have seen has errors or omissions regarding passive skills and legendary effects, as not all multiplicative stats are multiplied against your overall damage, and can instead be applied only against a small portion of your damage. This video will start from the beginning and explain in detail how and where different additive and multiplicative values are applied, what damage buckets are, and walk you through some examples to help illustrate the concepts. The first thing to do for any sort of damage analysis in Diablo 4 is to go to your options and in the Gameplay tab turn on Advanced Tooltip Information. This will let you see in the tooltips themselves whether an ability is additive or multiplicative. However, these indicators are only partly helpful as they fail to say what portion of the overall equation they are added to or multiplied against. As a general concept, multiplicative stats are better than additive stats. If you were to have 5 different additive modifiers for 50% bonus damage each, you add an extra 50% of the base value each time, giving you a total of 250% increased damage. If these modifiers are instead multiplicative, then with each one, you are multiplying the total value by an additional 50%, resulting in 659% increased damage. This is why it is important to understand how various damage modifiers are actually combined. I'll also remind everyone right here that when converting from the text format of extra or bonus percent into a decimal, you are adding that extra percent to a 1 value representing your original base damage of 100%. A bonus of 50% damage means you're dealing 150% of your base damage. The user interface will show you whether a stat is additive or multiplicative, however it is not quite that simple. There are different groupings of stats. Each grouping is multiplicative with the other groupings, yet within a grouping there can be a nested set of additive and multiplicative values, and that nested set of values may have within it yet another nested set of additive and multiplicative values. The additive or multiplicative icon in the user interface says if it is multiplicative, but it doesn't say what exactly it is multiplying. Most multipliers will be global multipliers as described in the other guides. However, there are some multipliers that will only apply to a subset of stats and can be drastically less effective than a global multiplier. The high-level groupings of stats will come as no surprise to anyone who has already heard of damage buckets in Diablo 4. The main groupings are weapon damage, skill damage, your primary stat, damage stats, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, and overpower damage. Categories are multiplied together to determine your damage dealt. Overpower damage is a completely separate system and won't be covered in this video, but your overpower damage is simply added on to the rest of the equation. The first two categories are very straightforward and create the baseline for damage dealt. You can see weapon damage on the weapon itself or in your character stats, and the skill damage is seen within the tooltip of the particular ability that you are using. On any given hit, a random value is generated within the damage range, which is then multiplied by the skill modifier. All skills have a multiplier based on weapon damage, so go ahead and forget any Diablo 2 notions of spells being treated differently than weapon attacks. All skills and attacks in Diablo 4 will scale directly with weapon damage. The average weapon damage showing in your character sheet is correct, and the percent modifier displayed in the skill tooltip is correct, but the numbers and ranges displayed in the skill tooltip are flat out wrong. I had recorded about a 5-minute rant detailing the math for why the tooltips are wrong, but I cut that out of this video as it really isn't important to understanding these general systems. Just know that if you do any testing yourself, you should base it on the average weapon damage on the character sheet and the skill multiplier itself, and ignore the flat values in the skill tooltip. The actual damage range is also wider than displayed, but the average damage in the character sheet remains reliable. The third category is your main stat multiplier. You can tell which stat is your class's main stat by looking at the descriptions of them in your character sheet and finding the one that says increases skill damage. This percent is a true global multiplier and will actually increase your net damage by the exact amount stated here. The fourth category encompasses all other damage modifiers that aren't for critical hits, vulnerable damage, or overpower damage, and it is split into an additive half and a multiplicative half. The additive half includes all of the secondary stats on gear. If you have one of these on your equipped gear, it will show up in your character stats. This includes all damage, damage versus a condition, damage while in a condition, damage with an element, damage with a skill type, and so forth. All of these are additive values, and you'll simply add them together to create the first half of this damage category. The other half of the category is the globally multiplicative damage values. Some other guides consider it a separate category, but as they are globally multiplicative, the math is the same either way. Most skills or legendary effects that have the multiplicative indicator will fall into this category. There is inconsistent formatting in the tooltips, and this can be shown in at least 2 different ways. You do, in some cases, have to carefully parse the text. Sometimes the word vulnerable may be included, but it is merely used as a condition to be met. Here's an example where vulnerable is a condition, and if that condition is met, it is instead a global multiplier included here. This is where we also start to get into a level of detail omitted in the other guides. The tooltips can be unfortunately vague or ambiguous, but not all multipliers are global multipliers. Here's an example. On first glance, you may expect this to include a 12% global multiplier when attacking a distant enemy. Instead, this only multiplies your stat for damage dealt to distant enemies. If we expand the additive portion of this category to show the individual additive stats, the multiplier is only applied to the distant portion. Here I have 0% distant damage, while if I equip a ring with 10% of this stat, it increases to 10% in my character sheet. Once I learn the skill for a 12% increase, I now have 12% distance damage without the ring, or 23.2% with the ring. The practical effect of this is that rather than giving a global 12% modifier, it is only increasing one of your single additive stats. This skill, after its multiplication, will only provide about a flat 12 to 24% for the additive stat, which will often be maybe a 2 to 6% net increase to your overall damage, significantly less than a 12% global multiplier. Thus, understanding where these multipliers are located in the overall equation shows that they can be worth far less than if they're a general multiplier. Just to make it more fun, Blizzard decided that some passive skills, like this one, are deactivated while in town along with all of your active abilities, so you will only see this 12% multiplier while outside of town. The 5th category includes critical strike damage. Assuming that the hit in question is a critical strike, your damage will be multiplied by your critical strike damage. To determine an average damage, you multiply the critical strike damage by your critical strike chance. In the same way that I just described with respect to the distant damage modifiers, critical strikes also have an additive portion and a multiplicative portion. Additive values are added to a base value of 50% crit damage, which is already included in your character sheet values. Here you can see an additive legendary aspect, a multiplicative legendary aspect, a multiplicative passive skill, and a multiplicative class passive. These multiplicative modifiers are not global multipliers, but instead are applied only to your critical strike damage bonus. To make this even more confusing, I have determined that this is applied to not all types of critical strike damage, but only to the base critical strike damage stat. So the critical damage formula turns into something more like this. If you have no critical multipliers, all of the additive sources of critical damage are equally important. But if you do have critical multipliers, base critical damage will be stronger than other sources of critical damage. Since this portion of my formula differs from other guides that I have seen, I'll give a quick explanation of why it is the more correct formula. In a test I did using bone shards to test critical strike damage, when I had 0 multipliers, my average damage per hit was 4960. When I added a 30% multiplier, a 36% multiplier, and a 108% multiplier, the average damage per hit increased to 13,897. Thus, the second test was 2.8 times the first. But if these multipliers were all global multipliers, we would instead expect the second average to be 3.68 times the damage. While if the multipliers were applied to all of the critical damage modifiers, including critical damage with bone skills, we would expect the second average to be 3.16 times the first. Using my formula, where the multipliers are applied only against the base crit damage stat, we would expect the result to be 2.84 times the first test. This does in fact align with my empirical findings. These findings are further reinforced by looking at the Necromancer Golem Sacrifice 30% crit damage multiplier, which is reflected in the character sheet and shows a 30% increase to crit damage, but not to bone crit damage or crowd control crit damage. The 6th category includes vulnerable damage. Assuming that your target is vulnerable, your damage is multiplied based on your vulnerable damage. Vulnerable damage has a base of 20% bonus, and additional vulnerable damage is additive with the base 20%. I could not find any effects that are multiplicative here, but there could be one, and it would likely work the same as I just described with critical damage. Now, why is it even important to understand these different categories? The main thing will be for when you're comparing possible gear upgrades that have different stats, or enchanting one stat to another. Let's use this weapon as an example. Is the critical strike damage with bone skills the best stat to have enchanted? Or should I aim to replace it with another stat? The likely contenders are either going to be 63% critical strike damage, 70.5% vulnerable damage, or 70.5% damage to a conditional enemy, such as stun, slowed, or close. I already have 662 intelligence and 204.8% additive bonuses. I have the equivalent of 1478.9% bonus critical strike damage and 53.7% vulnerable damage. You might think that with my crazy critical strike multipliers, that additional critical strike would be the way to go. Or maybe you're thinking that one of the 70.5% values will be the same as the other. But here are the actual numbers, which illustrate the importance of where stats go in the formula. If I leave the weapon alone, I will have an overall damage multiplier of 122.9. If I instead change it to a 63% normal crit damage, my overall multiplier will be 136.5. Alternatively, 70.5% as an additive stat will give me an overall multiplier of 145.9, while 70.5% vulnerable damage will give me a multiplier of 172.8. If we divide these multipliers by the beginning multiplier before we made any changes, you can see what the actual net difference will be to my overall damage with each possible stat change. In this case, the vulnerable damage would give me the most, with 41% more net damage. The additive stat would give me 19% more net damage, while switching to normal crit damage would only give me 11% more net damage. These comparisons will be easiest if you set up a spreadsheet, but if you want to avoid doing the math, the general principle is that you want the different main categories to be as equal as possible. As I have crazy high crit damage, further crit damage adds very little. But I have low additive and vulnerable modifiers, so these categories will do a significant amount for me. Despite what some people may say, it remains quite important to have additive bonuses, although these are the easiest type of modifier to receive in the Paragon boards, which will generally mean that on gear, crit damage and vulnerable damage will be more attractive. Hopefully this has helped explain and illustrate the way that stats affect damage in Diablo 4. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and subscribe.